Quick break and not straying too far. Those of you who just held tight in your seats, you are my favorite today. Thank you very much. So we are now ready to get started. I'm going to keep talking a little bit in the hopes that the folks out in the hallway come on back in and join us for what should be a really exciting panel discussion about the technology of engagement. So as you've noticed today, our theme throughout the day is to be talking about the technology. We talked about the technology of censorship and the number of governments that we are seeing use technologies in different ways, including through passing regulations requiring the use of filtering technologies or other kinds of blocking technologies as a way to try to control speech online. We've also talked a lot, though, about genuine challenges out there, things like hate speech, harassment, disinformation, and in fact there are lots of discussions about regulations of technology to try to deal with some of those problems, try to figure out what are solutions that can help improve everybody's access to information and ability to participate online. On this panel, we're actually going to dig more into questions about how things like technical design really do affect the kinds of information and engagement and conversations that happen on different platforms and tools and services. We're going to talk about technology, but also about all of the different things that interact with technology to kind of set the tone for a site and steer it in a direction of constructive engagement, or in some cases, a very destructive engagement as well. So I'm joined, and I will join, a group of wonderful panelists. I'll do a quick intro, and then we'll dive right into conversation. So we have joining us on this panel, Nathan Matias, who's the founder of the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell University. Tanya Mitra, the professor in the Department of Computer Science at Virginia Tech, who also leads the Social Computing Research Group there. Andrew Lazovsky, who is the head of Coral at Vox Media. And Tara Sussman-Pena, who's the Senior Technical Advisor at IREX. So to get us started, I'll turn to Nathan first. At the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell University, you engage in a variety of different kinds of research. What have you looked into or studied in this question of how technical design affects sort of people's use of and the information on different kinds of online platforms?
Sure, yeah. So the Citizens and Technology Lab works together with the public for a world where digital power is both guided by evidence and accountable to the public. And over the last 3-4 years, we've worked with communities of sometimes tens of millions of people to test ideas for preventing harassment, for managing the spread of misinformation, not just by humans, but also by algorithms. We've tested ways for reducing and managing political conflict in highly contentious partisan environments. We've also organized citizen science audits of platform policies around things like political ads and how platforms handle cases of harassment. And so we're deeply enmeshed in these questions of, like, where is the problem being driven by technology? Where are there solutions from technology? But also, to what degree are the things we worry about, like deeper social, civic, and political challenges? And where might we actually be missing the ball if we just think that tech companies are responsible and the only ones who can create change?
Now to bring Tanya Mitra into the conversation. So you've done research on evaluating how sites like Reddit implement principles of fairness and accountability and transparency in their moderation practices. What did that sort of research entail, and what kinds of things did you find?
Yeah, so this morning's panel kind of talked a lot about the company, how the company does moderation. So I think one cool thing about Reddit is, on top of the site level or platform or company level moderation, there is a second tier of moderation where things start getting really interesting, which is where citizens or normal Reddit users called moderators, they are the one creating the rules for the communities and trying to moderate and remove content or removing comments and so on. So what we wanted to look at is, how does moderation work in this second tier governance structure? Do they follow principles of transparency? And then the next question is, as soon as we talk about principles of transparency, how do we even measure that, whether these moderators are really transparent in the way they are moderating content, in the way they're moderating users, and the platform itself. So what we did was we looked at Santa Clara Principles of Transparency, which is a set of 3 core recommendations for how companies should be transparent about their moderation principles. The first is companies should reveal the number of numbers, so essentially how many things they are moderating, what count of users they are sanctioning, and so on. The second is the notice, which is where we kind of focused on. The notice is essentially whenever a company is moderating something, they should basically tell the users the reasons why they are moderating, and let them understand the moderation process. And if they are using auto moderators or some sort of automated tools for moderating, they should also reveal the process of how that automatic system works. And then the third aspect is the appeals process. That is, if content is being moderated right now, users do not really have a way to appeal these moderation actions. So is there a way that the company can enforce or allow people to appeal? So we kind of tried to look at all 3 aspects in our study, and what we found, and we basically focused more on the notice aspect, and what we found was Reddit moderators themselves are not that transparent in terms of providing them users' reasons how and why their content is being moderated. And so initially we were a bit puzzled, but then when we started talking to these moderators, trying to understand their practices, what we realized there are they have their own set of principles why they're not doing this, because A, this could cause gaming of the system, and B, which is I think where technologists like us could come into picture, is there is no good design mechanisms within Reddit which will allow them to do this more seamlessly. So I guess that raises those questions. How can we design platforms or redesign some of these platforms to allow these volunteer moderation works much more easier and let them surface these transparent moderation practices to the users?
That's great. And I think I'd love to come back to that question of gaming of these systems later in the conversation. But first, let me bring Andrew Lazovsky into the discussion. So your work at Coral has focused on supporting online communities. And what have you learned about designing for constructive or functional communities online?
So at Coral, we design software and strategies for more than 110 different news sites right now in 14 countries. So if you go to the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Seattle Times, the LA Times, the Financial Times, these are all using our software to run their comments and conversations. And the starting point really was how terribly the comments had gone, how awful these spaces were, and how they were not only pushing away people who wanted to contribute, but journalists were actively removing themselves from the conversation. It was becoming a real speech issue about whether journalists were even engaging with the readership at all, which led to deficits in trust and transparency and so on. And for us, our starting point was really similar to what Nathan referred to as well, that this isn't primarily a technology problem, and it isn't technology only that can solve it. The first thing was that this is a social and a cultural problem and a strategic problem. If here in this room everybody was screaming and swearing and attacking each other, we wouldn't start by blaming the architect of the building. And yet we seem to feel like, oh, no, we just need better architecture, and that will solve all the online problems. It starts with social and cultural. And so we did a lot of research on the more than 30 years now of what we have of academic understanding of online communities. And then from there started with the strategies and helping publishers, journalists think about what it means to host a conversation themselves and how to set that up for success. And then when it came to designing the space, there was an aspect in which if in this room it was impossible to be heard if we weren't screaming, then maybe the architecture does lead to certain biases. And so then that leads to us designing a platform that is not aimed at getting people to come back at all costs. It is not designed around, if you're outraged, you keep coming back, and that's amazing for us because we want to show you ads. We don't have ads in our platform. We don't have surveillance in our platform. So our goal is for a better conversation. And that leads to a whole different set of design decisions from those from the major social media platforms.
And finally, Chara, I know from your perspective working on media and information literacy, how have you seen technical design kind of fuel problems like disinformation, and what do you think needs to be done in response to that?
Yes. So Maybe I'll start at a very, very, the 10,000-foot level, sort of thinking about, people have mentioned that it's a human problem, it's a social problem, it's a cultural problem. It's also a problem, I think, of the disjuncture between the development of technology and how the human brain has been developing. So I was just thinking, if you were to try and put together a graph of the development of information technology over time, you'd have like a pretty flat line, and then over the last 10 or 20 years, you'd have a giant leap upward. If you were to try and graph the development of the human brain, and when there's been huge leap forwards, like rapid development, a time of rapid development in the human brain was like 600,000 years, right? So there's not even the same scale. So we're clearly not evolving fast enough to be able to deal with the kinds of things that the technology we're interacting with every day that we produce as a species, right, are creating. So because of that, media literacy needs to be sort of much broader and at the same time much narrower than I think sometimes it's conceived of. So it's not only just about verification, but it's about a whole suite of kind of tools and approaches. IRIX's methodology, we call it learn to discern, that takes in considerations of brain science, emotions, very, very important before you can even get to the critical thinking skills, which are, of course, really, really important. And I think it's important to note also that our methodology we developed our methodology in Ukraine in 2015, so on the front lines of the information wars. So it was very much kind of tuned to help people try to deal with a space in which there was a lot of different types of confusing information that was very, very hard to navigate. We work with students, but we also work with adults of all different ages. And we do believe there's a lot that can be done at the human level. It's just a piece of the puzzle, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle.
Well, I know I have a lot of questions for you, but I wanted to first just give the panelists a moment if you want. If there was anything that one of your co-panelists said that you wanted to respond to or that really kind of struck you as something to comment on, the floor is yours. Or I can shift us into the question that we've glossed over a little bit, or at least I certainly did in my introduction, of kind of talking about constructive engagement, right? Like we want to foster something good, something positive. And the open question for all of you, how do you think about defining and then measuring good or positive or constructive engagement? What is it that when you're either testing systems or creating tools for people to use, what is it that you are driving to, and how do you come to that definition?
Well,
go ahead.
I can talk a bit from the media literacy perspective, which is maybe a slightly different perspective. So we're teaching skills, and so we are very evidence-driven. We don't want to do anything that's going to cause any harm. And the reason, actually, I think that our work has expanded so much is that we have quite good evidence that the approach works. So we are testing. We're testing to see if people's skills hold up, and do they hold up over time, not just immediately afterward. And not just how people talk about them, not just a self-report, but actually testing skills. I think we haven't gotten to the point yet of being able to test increased emotional resilience, but that is something that we teach, and I think that it's a really important component. And then the other piece for us, we do a lot of face-to-face training. So we observe, we see sort of what it is that people are interested in, how they're engaging, and how they're changing or what they're asking for.
Yeah, so in my research, there are a few things that we think about. First, we think about positive behaviors. We also think about positive beliefs and feelings, and then also the environment. And one thing that's really important to remember is that what counts as positive in one context can be very different than others. So recently, I published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science that looked at this question of trying to prevent harassment through social norms interventions. And I did it with this community, which now has over 22 million subscribers, who discuss peer-reviewed scientific research on Reddit. And for that community, positive engagement involved having a good conversation about the science, they actually have a rule against jokes, which you might not normally think of as something you would want to ban in a positive conversation. But quite often when someone posts a scientific study about gender, or about human origins, or about climate, or about anything that really touches on a contentious issue, people will try to veil their hatreds and harassment through jokes. And so they decided as a community, we're here for this particular kind of conversation, and we don't think that jokes are actually positive here. And we ended up doing this study, and we found that posting very clear policies against harassment and making clear those consequences not only prevented newcomer participants from engaging in unruly behavior, but it actually increased participation by a massive percentage. And that's where thinking not only about what people say, but who participates is an incredibly important part of this conversation, especially if we're thinking about the future of speech online for people in democratic societies where we care about hearing from and supporting a broad range of voices.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, that we've got to remember that this isn't only about being positive about things and writing nice things, that there are often times where it's important to disagree. Especially this is a time where people feel extremely emotionally involved in what is happening in the news or might be happening to their communities. We shouldn't be removing what they're saying because it's not happy. And I think that what really the key is making sure that it doesn't fall into attacking each other. So this is about trying to find connections within the space. It doesn't need to be positive in terms of sentiment or emotion in those terms.
So I want to add on to what Nathan said, and then I'll say about some other line of research. But actually, we also found something similar in our Reddit study, where if you are thinking of designing any sort of computational system to kind of stop moderate speech, and you build this, being from a CS department, as Amy pointed out in the previous panel, we have this thing about all building rules and lists and making the AI perfect to moderate speech, right? And so we found that when these sort of auto-moderation bots were working on Reddit platforms and they were banning based on certain usage of words, and then when newcomers came in, they had no idea that these words were not allowed in these platforms. So that automatically set out a backfire effect. They were completely hindered from participating. So when thinking about designing these sort of, thinking about moderation, we really need to think about how do we put context into picture so that we do not dissuade newcomers from participating in these platforms. So that's one aspect that I wanted to point out. Going back to your question about how do we design constructive engagement, I believe that we focus too much on how do we detect misinformation, how do we detect harassment. Maybe another way to think about this problem is, instead of shining light on what's bad behavior, why not shine light on what's good behavior? And this might not work in every context, but we have been trying out this line of work where we are more from the context of how news is being produced. So instead of showing what's fake news and what's misinformation, we are trying to find out or shine light on how mainstream journalism, how good journalism is being produced. And so far with the initial, and that has actually caused a lot more constructive engagement with how news is being produced. So our initial design, we are still testing out, like showing them how journalists work in the newsrooms, and then what kind of message what are the key principles which make this message important or newsworthy, and who is producing these messages. So let's say if it's a war news, and the source of the message or the author who edited that message or promoted that news has 10 years of experience writing war stories. So that's something which you would find in mainstream journalism, but not really in non-mainstream alternative news sources, right? So that's a kind of another way of thinking. Maybe if you kind of shine light on these positive behaviors or actual good behaviors, you might be able to dissuade bad behavior rather than thinking the other way around.
So it's interesting. One thing that I've heard, I think each of you talk about, is the importance of context and the importance of tailoring different kinds of, whether it's policies or technical interventions, to particular communities. And I wonder, kind of a two-part question. One, are there any things that you've seen that really seem to be kind of across-the-board best practices, or you know, decisions in design or policy that seem to do well all the time or poorly all the time? And related to that, kind of an open question of how you think about the issue of scale, right? Because scale is kind of the defining feature of the internet and online communication. The internet enables us to have radically more speech online posted by basically anybody with an internet connection. And the result is this, in some ways, totally unmanageable scale of communication that can't be reviewed before it's published, because then every human being would have to be employed in the process of content moderation. So scale is huge. Scale is in both senses of the word. But on the other hand, it sounds like a lot of different kinds of inventions that might work particularly well aren't necessarily scalable, or the things that the way we think of scalable. So kind of an open question on both of those concepts. One, are there things that kind of work either at scale or across the board? And how do you think about sort of the relationship between developing good interventions and the sort of mass, unimaginable scale of online communication writ large?
I can start with scale, I guess, if there's a moment. So this is a question that we get asked all the time, because we feel, and again, this is in a media literacy context where we're equipping people with skills. And a lot of the way that our methodology works is it's very hands-on, it's very interactive, it's meant to be fun. It includes some elements of traditional media literacy, like you were just mentioning, Tanu, but this sort of whole other more rounded approach as well. But how easy is that to do if it's in a room of one trainer and 15 students? So we've been struggling with this a lot, and I have some sort of partial ideas about it, but I think maybe we're not quite there yet. I mean, I think the thing that we know that it's not is that it's not technology only, because there's something about the trust networks and the human connection that's very, very important for something like this. So in our initial Ukraine project, we did through a cascading training model where we trained basically citizen leaders such as librarians and teachers, and they trained their peers, and sort of so on and so on and so on. We reached 15,000 people within about 7 months. So quite a bit more than we had promised to do, and quite more than we were quite surprised. And then through our encouraging of asking people to share what they had learned with other people, we calculated by what people told us about how many people they had shared it with, that we had indirectly reached 90,000 people. We also did public service announcements, which I think are good at awareness raising, but maybe not skill building so much. Those reached about 2 million people in Ukraine. And here we've now been experimenting with online platforms, with blended learning, with web-based courses for the great courses based here in the U.S. So and that I don't know the answer to yet. We don't actually have the data, and for us that's really important, again, the evidence. But I think it's certainly going to take a lot of human ingenuity and testing to see what works. But we have some ideas of how to get to scale.
And it sounds like with like tapping into existing networks of actual human beings as a way to try to amplify the trainings that you can give and get information further into communities.
In communities where there is trust already, in places like libraries, or through teacher networks, or places where we know it's not political, and that there's automatically sort of trusted community leaders who we know don't have a hidden agenda. Yeah.
On the scale question with online dialogue, we can do scale. We know we can do scale. That's actually not a problem. The problem is, where are the costs? And who bears those costs? Because we can do scale right now, because we have these platforms where billions of people can get there. The trouble is that the costs are not all being paid by the platforms. They're being paid by us. They're being paid by society. They're being paid by democracy. And they are paying some of the costs, but more of those costs are going into the trauma of the 100,000 moderators they're hiring, but they're not paying for their counseling. In other words, there are huge externalities. You could call them pollutions, you could call them externalities, whatever you like, but that the question is more who bears the cost and who should bear the cost, because doing scale is not a problem. It's what happens next.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that is that, like, we just had 2 decades of the tech industry scaling things beyond our ability to know what that's actually doing in society, right? Even though the tech industry has developed unprecedented social scientific capacities based on the mass surveillance of us all, they've focused that energy on testing ads and, you know, selling things to people, and haven't invested the resources into actually understanding what the impacts are in people's lives. And we've reached this point as a result that a large percentage of Americans and people around the world don't trust the tech industry to do the right thing most of the time, according to recent research by Pew. And I think that's a good reason to do the kind of citizen science that I've dedicated my work to, where we know that some things might be helpful across the wide range on social norms. We know that when powerful institutions or people in power say something is okay or not okay, that does influence behavior. We know, there are psychologists who do work on emotion, and we know that emotions also drive, like anger and other things drive online behavior. But a huge amount of influence comes from the people around us. It's context dependent. And that's where, it's not enough just to scale something and test it at a population level. We really need to study and understand how something works and how effective it is in different subpopulations, in different contexts. And that's one argument for the citizen science approach, to work with communities on that research.
Yeah, I think most of it has already been said, and I agree with almost all of them. So I think to answer the question of how do we handle scale, the best example is some of the widely run these networks and communities, Wikipedia, Reddit, how their moderations work and scale with lots of volunteer moderators, volunteers actually running these systems seamlessly, right? So maybe that's where we draw inspiration from, how to tackle these bigger questions of inaccurate content, misinformation, and so on. I think the second way could be to actually flip the dynamics of engagement. So a lot of these problems, as Nathan was also pointing out, like this emotion-laden engagement is what's causing be it radical speech or hate speech or misinformation popping up in the top of your news feed, right? So I've been tinkering with this idea, and Jonathan Haidt is probably the pioneer of this notion of moral foundations. So what if you design systems where you redesign the button labels from like and angry to love and respect, right? So that might be one way of thinking about where those sort of subtle nudges can it be flip the dynamics of engagement from a like and anger-based dynamics to more moral foundation-based dynamics. And so it's not that I'm the first one to talk about this. So Talia Stroud from UT Austin, she has done this work with testing respect and like button, and turns out if you actually add respect button instead of like button, it involves much more engaging. Users are much more engaged with the news content when you add respect button versus like button. So those are some few design aspects that you could also use to kind of flip this dynamic of engagement and work at this problem of scale from a different angle.
So one thing I know that each of you has mentioned is the importance of having an evidence base, right? Of not just kind of rolling out a solution to a problem before you know what the problem is, before you know what can measure the potential impact. What are barriers to research in this field, right? Or what are areas that you think need to be much more deeply explored, and are there challenges that you find in your own work to actually getting access to the information that you need to do these kinds of experiments?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think some of the barriers are ideas and are the creativity of researchers, and then some of them are like institutional and legal barriers. So a couple of ideas that I think are real barriers for researchers. One is this assumption that we need to collaborate with companies to make this happen. You know, they're big, they have money, they collect a lot of data, and so we think it's going to be easier if we ask them for permission and negotiate with them to get access to data. I've found in my citizen science work that for every study I've done that's been a collaboration with a company, I've probably done 5 or 6 that have involved directly collaborating with the public. Because you're working with the people who are affected by it, and they have a personal interest in seeing this research happen. On top of that, I think there's an idea among some researchers that they're afraid of asking for permission from the public, that they want to do research without the consent or knowledge or involvement of the public. And I think that ends up being a barrier because then researchers don't consider approaches that involve direct public engagement, pushing them towards accepting the constraints and strings that come along with collaborations with industry. In terms of actual additional institutional and structural constraints, I think part of it has to do with just the power that the tech industry has to have terms of service that restrict research, that align with things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, making researchers unsure whether they could actually face cybercrime laws if they do this research. Alongside more generally a need for more investment in research infrastructures that add economies of scale to the kind of accountability and public interest research that we need. Tech companies have massive internal social science teams building infrastructures that make individual studies super cheap if they're asking questions about marketing. We need parallel systems that enable that for the public interest. There are a few like Lumen, like Media Cloud, like our work on Civil Servant that do that, but there needs to be more, and those need to grow.
So I could say for the case, again, of media literacy, which is a bit slightly different, we've made it such a priority to be collecting evidence on this, in part because media literacy as a field has been around for at least 20 years, and there's quite a bit of research, but there's not a lot of empirical evidence about what works and what doesn't work to sort of specifically make these gains that everybody's talking about nowadays. There's a lot of kind of public gesturing towards media literacy as a very important thing, but it's actually a giant umbrella that holds a lot of different types of things. And what's within that is not very well measured. So that's really a challenge because we need just a much broader and richer field of evidence about what is working and what is potentially not working or having reverse effects. And then I think some kind of broader pulse on not just what we've done and our impact or anyone else who's teaching media literacy skills, but publics at large, right? We, all of us, myself included, I have to say, think that we're more media literate than we really are. Everyone can think of someone else that needs it, but me, I don't need it, right? So try to get a bit more of an objective read on sort of where the skill strengths are, where the weaknesses are relative to sort of what the technology picture looks like today would be really useful.
I'm going to open it up now to questions from the audience, things that you'd like to ask the panelists, things you want to hear more about. Questions. I mean, one question I had for all of you while folks in the audience gather their thoughts. So there are lots of debates about all of these questions around content moderation and platform responsibility, intermediary liability. It's more talked about now than I've ever seen before, in working on these issues. And there was a part of me that back when I was in law school, first learning about this, thought like I'd love it for people to be actively engaged and thinking about all of these online speech issues now. And it's a dark mirror that we've gone through. The way the conversations are happening now are significantly negative in frame, and understandably so because of the number of challenges and problems people see out there. But from your perspectives as people with kind of evidence-based expertise in these areas, what do you wish either policymakers or the media understood better about what it is that you work on and what it is that you're devoted to? What are the messages that you would give to them about here's what you really need to understand to have a more thoughtful and genuine sort of like solution-oriented conversation about whatever these problems are?
What I would say would be, like, let's try to have an evidence-based conversation. I realize that in some sense, I represent the plumber contingent of these issues. Esther Duflo, who recently won the Nobel Prize in economics, famously describes the role she wants economists to have as plumbers, right? You want to be like doing evidence-based work and making sure that things are working. And I think what happens all too often is that either a tech CEO says something and everyone rushes to say whether it's good or bad. And we don't even know what the company is going to do at that stage. And everyone's decided what it's going to be great for society. And we set ourselves up for these horrific revelations when the things that we hope are going to be helpful or the fears that we had lead us to do things that make things worse. And so my central message for policymakers and journalists is like, if someone makes a claim, expect them to back it up based on actions and knowledge of outcomes. And if there's a dearth of that, and there is a dearth of that, then like support that evidence, because this is stuff that affects real people's lives, it affects the democracies we're part of. And the power that has been amassed in our digital lives vastly outweighs our ability to use it wisely right now.
Yeah, I'd echo a couple of things that have been said actually at this event earlier from, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, the person from CPJ who talked about, let's reframe this from, should the government be regulating speech? That's obviously a very complicated area that probably it should be careful around. Should it be regulating the ability to target with data and to bring all of that data together, and should companies be free to do and sell and aggregate to a point beyond what any individual would probably want if they were given the option. There was discussion about Communications Decency Act Section 230. I also agree that all of the things that lawmakers have threatened to do to it are far worse than leaving it in place. And so leaving it in place is a much better default right now. The idea that a lot of online activity that people really complain about is already illegal, and yet is enforced incredibly unevenly, mostly by law enforcement who do not understand the internet and say, just switch off the computer and it's done, without understanding credible threats, harassment, and abuse, and think that that's reasonable. And I think also that there is a level, and I don't know if this, and I have very mixed feelings about the idea of any of this being regulated, but certainly called out, is that any platform that is encouraging people to participate and interact that does not have robust reporting mechanisms, does not have mechanisms in place from day one, and how to deal with abuse, harassment, misinformation, terrorism content, revenge porn, and more, is being negligent to a point that I think there could be some form of punitive aspects for that. We are not in a place anymore where we can say, I had no idea this would happen. And that if you genuinely believe that, then you have been failed by your teachers and by whoever taught you code. But usually it is disingenuous because the market says build that later when the problems come, and then we are endangering people repeatedly and pushing people away from the internet from day one, and each time it is more difficult to come back.
So I guess I wanted to just reiterate what I said and then kind of build on it a bit more about that these kinds of problems are all of our problems and all of our responsibility. And just getting back to sort of the design, what do I wish that the media and others in power would know or take into account? Getting back to the question about sort of design and how so much of technology is created with these sort of flaws in the human brain, specifically in mind, right? I mean, it's designed to keep us hooked. It's designed with using the principles of sort of gambling addiction. And I love these moments where I'm looking around and I'm actually seeing this at play, like in live as we're doing this live, it is happening. People are on their phones and it's not because it's anybody's fault. It's because it is designed that way. Like a notification comes up, and can I resist picking up my phone? This is not This is not because it's a me, individual human failing. This is a design issue, right? And so if we keep ignoring that, then we're going to miss some kind of big piece of the solution, right? So there needs to be design solutions, but also sort of human capacity solutions to deal with this very uneven playing field of sort of the individual versus the tech.
Yeah, they're pocket casinos. Yeah.
Can I briefly add like a closing comment? So I'll take a slightly different take on this. So I'm really glad that this sort of one-day summit has brought in people from policy, law, and technologists and everybody in this room. So like when in the morning panel, Evelyn mentioned about those 3-part tests. In my mind, I was like, okay, how do we apply this test in a real platform in a way that we make those decisions so that it abides by those policies and the rules. And I wish there was more of these sort of gatherings and more time we had where the lawyers in the room and the policy experts actually interacted with the computer science person or the media literacy expert, so that we can come up collaboratively with these solutions and not impose all of a sudden a law which is totally very difficult to actually put in practice. So.
I'll turn back. Questions in the audience? Thoughts? Oh yes, great, in the back here.
I was just wondering what the panel believes about which level of data should be regulated and which one would be most beneficial. So at the very end, when it's posted on the platform, or before it gets posted on the platform, and are there any, like as you were saying about the design, are there any benefits to these designs? They're always painted in a negative way, but there has to be some sort of benefit to them as well.
Okay, so for folks on the live stream, sort of two questions. One about at what point should content be moderated, I guess? Like, should we be looking at things kind of at the moment of upload? Should we be looking at content only after it's been reported to a platform or somewhere in between? And the second is there anything positive? Is there anything positive to this and to different design choices or the availability of technologies? We talk a lot about things in a negative framing or the problems that are caused, but is there an upside?
Yeah, I mean, these technologies connect people for good and evil, and there are lots of incredibly powerful things about connecting people. We were talking earlier about the Arab Spring. There are many instances of bringing people together and connecting them that can be hugely beneficial. The question is more about when it is negative, what does that mean? How does that happen? And to what extent does the design of the platform encourage different kinds of behaviors versus discourage, and why? Are they doing it out of a beneficial sense of society? Probably not. What are the biases in the platform and why are they built? Also, it feels good in the short-term moment. Dopamine is a hell of a drug. It feels really nice. Like casino we mentioned it's like a pocket casino. It gives you this buzz in the moment. Like these things are positive. But are they long-term positive? We actually don't know in the case of dopamine, but yeah, so I think there's certainly that. And when it comes to, were you asking about data or about content upload?
About data specifically, which I mean, in the end does relate to content.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's increasing pushbacks, things like CCPA in California coming in January around should any platform be allowed to do whatever it wants once you've given it its data? Do you even have the option of opting out? Do you have any understanding of what happens and how is? I did not deliberately opt in for my credit card records to be taken by Facebook and added to an advertiser profile. There is no way I can opt out if I have a credit card in this country, or at least most credit cards. And so understanding and controlling pieces of that, I think that's really key from my perspective.
So I have a few, I think one reason we find ourselves being pessimistic is that we don't do enough work to actually find out what works. Yeah, that's one of the most exciting and best parts of the work I do, where I get to talk with and work with people who are actually on the ground trying to make a difference. And then we find out together what does make a difference, that with this science discussion community, small things they do can prevent thousands of cases of harassment a month, just in one large community. Or in another discussion community, they were able to effectively crowdsource fact-checking in ways that prevented articles from being spread further by algorithms. Similarly, working with Wikipedians in 5 different languages to test ideas to spread appreciation and broaden participation in ways that make people feel valued. So when you focus on evaluation that actually tests ideas for change, you get that opportunity at the end of it to say, well, did this work? And if not, now we've at least identified something that we won't put more time into. And I think that kind of research is something we absolutely need more of.
Thanks a lot. I think this has been a really great conversation because the predicate of all of it has been that we need to think about this all a little bit more. And I think that's an important stance in and of itself because, you know, our prior speaker, who was also two prior speakers, the opening speaker for the afternoon, it was a lot about people who don't want change immediately don't want change. And that's not accurate. Sometimes you just want to think about change, it seems to me. And you're not necessarily, you know, immediately in the, oh, I'm going to have bicycle face if I ride a bicycle crowd, because you just want to stop and think about very complex societal effects that are happening to us, where indirectly they're using things like the dopamine effect, et cetera. We should be able to stop and say, I'm not so sure I want that, or I want it like it's been thrust at us. So I just wanted to say I think you all are achieving a lot just saying it's okay to stop and think about this. It's okay. Not all change is necessarily immediately good, and that we need to just pause for a bit. Not stop. We need to innovate. We need to go forward. But we haven't had a chance to talk about this huge acceleration, which really has been only in the past 10 or 12 years. So I congratulate you on the thought.
Thoughts, responses, or other? I think we have a question over here. Oh, sorry, we have a question here, and then we'll get to.
Hi, quick question. I don't want to open the can of worms of Section 230, but no. But so we saw the instance of Cloudflare when they took down 8chan, and that was an instance where incentivized, but both personal public interest and private interest aligned perfectly well. And instead of changing Section 230, what are some ways you can incentivize more of these type of actions? We see all the negative and failures of content moderation, but should focus on like the benefits and not making it all pessimistic, at least in the public media.
I think, you know, firms are incentivized all the time through public pressure on these things. You know, and that goes back well before the Web 2.0 period. You know, you look back to 2011 when public pressure led Instagram to pioneer some of the things we heard from Pinterest, like altering their search algorithms for public health reasons, even when European governments refused to pass laws forbidding certain kinds of self-harm content and so forth. But the risk with that kind of public pressure, you know, it affects CEOs' reputation, it affects the company's ability to hire and retain people, you know, influences share prices. But the risk is that that kind of public pressure is sometimes applied without, you know, with the same kind of like free, evidence-free approach as what tech companies sometimes put in place in the first place. And in fact, in the case of Instagram's attempt to ban self-harm material, or at least alter its priority, researchers came back 4 years later, and Stevie Chancellor at Georgia Tech found that that may have actually increased the popularity of that content. And so when there aren't mechanisms of public accountability and evaluation of what companies do, we get ourselves in these situations where pressured campaigns work. They influence what companies do, but then that might make things worse. And so even as we search for levers to shift what they do, we need that evaluative capacity to make sure that, you know, the public and the various advocates are actually pushing in a beneficial direction.
So just to add to that point, I feel like in the community, in the academic world that I belong to, there's this huge push about auditing online platforms from outside. So Facebook, Google, YouTube, Pinterest, any company won't allow a researcher to go inside the company and test with their algorithm. But there is a way you could do a lot from outside. And I think there, as a citizen, people can contribute. So let's say you contribute your own search results at a certain point in time, and 10 of your other friends contribute. And then as an academic auditor, you essentially can study how the search result of person A differs from with respect to the other 10 people, the remaining 10 friends, and is there a difference between gender, demographic, or other conditions? So those sort of audits need to be more central in our this sort of evidence-based approach. And I think those audits, if we can provide long-term support, so these audits are actually expensive. Like we are setting up these audits back in my institute. And just the whole infrastructure and server cost, it's hugely expensive. So how do we support that kind of research infrastructure, also data from the citizens, and then kind of do this on a long-term basis so that we can show companies the evidence, hey, there is problem with these harassment, search results, inaccurate content, and so on. And that's the right way probably to build up public pressure rather than saying, hey, you need to take down this content.
And something I would like to see, though I'm not holding my breath, is a reshaping of the venture capital system and an understanding really where the money goes to and why. And there's a couple of different pieces for that. One is that the goal of almost every startup that gets venture capital is to be sold to a bigger company. In other words, to gather as much data as it desperately can and then hand that data over to a larger pool. That's the goal for so many, and get in and out as quickly as possible. Doesn't matter if you make any money. And you can do that in an unethical way as long as it's legal and you are fine, and then that is almost encouraged. Not by all venture capitalists and not by all spaces, but overwhelmingly from what we've seen in the Valley. There is a movement, a group called Zebras, with the idea of unicorns don't exist, but zebras do. And this idea of building, what does it mean to build sustainable, ethical startups? With the right amounts of money so that they can actually try to create sustainable ongoing businesses, not one that are designed to flare out and they may or may not end up getting sold. And right now we've created all the wrong incentives within the market for this technology-based marketplace.
And Zebra is trying to do something around maybe getting people to acquire Meetup from
Make
its failed owner.
From WeWork. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Matthew Fowle. I'd like to connect some of the discussion that I heard today from this panel with some of an earlier panel discussion a little bit. Just to project some of my own feelings briefly, it feels like a lot of the platforms that we engage in kind of have their own, to borrow a word that I heard today, autocratic systems of being able to control and regulate and moderate themselves, that they are trying to shape engagement as they want. And we see tools like Slack or Reddit, where the tool is a tool for giving autocracy to other people. You create a subreddit or you create your own Slack channel, and then you are the king of that fief. And so I'm curious, one of the things that was interesting to me was talking about newstrition, was that is a distributed and decentralized form of moderation and media literacy and projection, where it's kind of up to us as people to figure out what stance we want to have as we're engaging with the content and the things that are in front of us. And we see certainly internet pioneers of many sorts coming together to talk about hashtag redecentralize, and that's kind of an infrastructure view, but it's also a content view. And I'm just curious how the panel, where they, I don't have a question per se, but I'm sorry, but where they see the role of redecentralize and how its relationship with engagement is, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, so you can't engineer democracy. And actually, there's a long social scientific tradition that people have replicated in online environments going back to the early 20th century. Menger Olson's iron law of oligarchy that looks at the evolution of institutions over time. Things that start out inclusive often tend to get controlled by a small number of people over time. And in fact, Benjamin Mako Hill and Aaron Shaw have shown that even in Wikipedia, across the website Wikia, which has hundreds and hundreds of wikis, things that start out inclusive, as people encounter more and more challenges, they have to formalize their policies for dealing with problems, and that creates structure, and that structure, in order to function, keeps some people out and centers other people. And so it actually takes a lot of work to maintain inclusive governance structures. And even in technical environments that have been designed for decentralization, it comes back. Now, on the other hand, there's lots of good evidence that when people put in that work, it actually happens. I have a paper I published this year on the civic labor of volunteer moderators on Reddit. And I found lots of examples where, even though the platform designed things to be controlled by a small number of moderators, communities did social hacks around that in order to have votes and democratic elections and other ways of holding those moderators accountable. And so I think as we kind of started out this panel asking how much can be shaped by the design of the technology and how much comes down to each of our activity and our work in the communities we're part of, that latter part is incredibly influential.
Well, I think we are just about out of time for the panel, so I will ask everybody to share closing thoughts, either reflections on everything that you've heard so far, or something that you are optimistic about or excited about in the future of all of this.
I think for...
Dig deep.
Yeah. For me, it's really something that we try and reinforce over and over again, is that the starting point is why are we gathering? And to reference something that Tanya mentioned, what does good look like? We spend all of our time saying this is either bad or acceptable, but if we aren't modeling good, then people don't know how you actually want them to behave. They only know how you don't want them to behave. And so spending a lot more effort on what are we trying to achieve here? How do we create that? Should we even be having the conversation in this way? Should we be using a different tool, a different space? And then what will good look like? What will success look like? And how can we spot it? Can make a huge difference.
I'll say that I do think that I feel cautiously optimistic, and specifically around the question of misinformation, because this is a lot of what we spend our time working with. I think that it seems challenging but possible that people can reshape not just their skills, but their perspectives and their minds and their abilities. But I think it does take some thought, as you mentioned. So it takes the interest in being analytical, and it takes some amount of will and commitment to doing it. But I do think in the end, the solution to misinformation is certainly a human solution, and that does make me feel optimistic.
I guess I would say that I've attended many of these panels on misinformation, disinformation in the past year, and every time the panel ends, and I'm getting out of the panel in a very disoriented and hopeless manner. Like, there is no solution. But I guess since this year, I feel like now people are moving from that hopeless situation to kind of, the 5 stages of acceptance. Now they have, actually tried to figure it out. Okay, there is hope, and then if we kind of attack at this problem from a different angle, we could definitely, not find the perfect solution, but some way of workaround. And I feel like the conversations that we have had throughout today with these multiple panels, there are a lot of important and very innovative ideas as were discussed, and I hope when we leave this day today and then we kind of implement and keep these conversations going and actually go from discussions to actually building these stuff and implementing the solutions.
I'm feeling hopeful and excited. And I think having a sense of perspective and time really helps. It took about a century for democracies to figure out drug testing, to the point where the science and the political will was there to actually test drugs before getting them out to the public. Probably going to be something completely different for social technology. Similarly, it took several generations to figure out how to do auto safety. We had to invent the science. We had to figure out what the regulations were. We had to figure out what we thought automobiles were going to be and what their role was going to be in society. And along the way, there were panics, there were citizen science initiatives that started up that seeded the creation of the more substantial societal testing and regulation. And I think we're at a point where people recognize that this is a really important set of questions that we're going to be asking throughout our lifetimes. And so I'm hopeful, because we've reached the point where we're having this conversation, and because so many people are working on it, that just as our democracies have, figured out ways to manage other issues that are complex, societal, and technical, we'll figure this one out too.
With that wonderful note to end on, and as Tara put it, challenging but possible, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. And I think now we're transitioning back to our last set of lightning talks. So stick where you are, and we will be back in 30 seconds or less.